typeset documents. And I'm old, I guess, so I was enough to have been around typesetting as a thing where you got film and you cut and pasted on, and then that's how you created typeset copy. But these new tools began to make it accessible to anybody, including writers. And my first job, really, was as a technical writer. I wrote computer manuals, and my first machine that I wrote about was a CNC machine. And it was called, this is a later version of it, but it was called Light Machines. It was connected to an Apple II, to give you an idea of where the technology was. And I knew nothing about it. I didn't know anything about computers. I studied English and history in college. But I knew how to ask questions. And I knew, in some ways, how to write. And just, I had to explain this, how it worked, to people that were going to use that system. And part of that, through that process, I met Tim O'Reilly, and we started really publishing little books, handbooks, nutshell handbooks. And it was just the idea that we could explain, at that time, the Unix operating system and some of the utilities it used. And then we went to trade shows. This is me in my 1980s, and my wife in the middle, and Tim O'Reilly on the left. And we'd sell it to programmers and others. And that's how we really started a publishing company, was sort of just doing those little handbooks. We didn't know what it meant to be a publisher or a printer, but we could do those things and figure it out as we went. Along the way, I was, soon after this, kind of interested in the late 80s in how to get those books about computers on computers, in effect to digitize them some way. And I was playing around with HyperCard, if you remember that. I took some of our books and put them into a HyperCard stack. And I began, just some different efforts in that. And I followed the hypertext ACM group. And I went to a conference in 1991. And who did I meet there? But Tim Berners-Lee. Now the funny thing is, this was a hypertext conference, kind of academic. Tim Berners-Lee applied to teach about the World Wide Web, or to showcase the World Wide Web in a talk. They rejected it. They didn't think it was important. They didn't think the web was very interesting. So he set up a poster session and just demoed it. And I got to talking to him and see what he could do. I thought, this is really interesting. And it was pretty much all text then. It was just, that if you're kind of old enough to remember Gopher and other things were more popular than the web. And O'Reilly was working on a book called The Whole Internet User's Guide and Catalog. And I came back and we were just about to send this off to the press. I said, stop. We've got to put a section on the World Wide Web in there. And we did. And, I really believed it was important. And I began to begin making plans to do something on the web, and I hadn't really figured out what. There was no business model for anything. There was nothing really out there. But in July 1993, Tim Berners-Lee and I organized the World Wide Web Workshop. We brought together developers of browsers and servers, like anybody that did anything related to the web. In 1993, that was about 30 people. And Mark Andreessen was a college student working on the Mosaic browser. And they came from Urbana-Champaign and showcased their work. And about a month later, I released GNN. I believe it was the first commercial website on the web. The internet had been kind of a academic thing. It wasn't necessarily used for business. And it began to change pretty quickly. So what I was really proud of on this is I figured out how to get a graphic on the web. And we were all concerned, with modems and low bandwidth. So we created individual strips there that could be sent as smaller files and that were compiled. And the one thing that came out of the World Wide Web Wizards Workshop was the alt tag on a graphic, so I could have text. If you read this in a text browser, you'd still be able to know what it was. So to me, that, from a publishing point of view, was how you could you couldn't create an identity with just plain text, but a graphic began to give you a feel. The other thing O'Reilly was involved with a lot was the free software, and it became open source software. And I think one of the takeaways from the Cathedral and the Bazaar, Eric Raymond's book, was, you want to know, why would anyone create free software? Why would you spend all that time doing something and then give it away? And his answer was, they're there to scratch their own itch. They have an idea for something, they just want to do it, and that's all they care about. And so, to me, this is the first maybe group that I recognize as kind of true believers. They had ideas other than business that they were about. They wanted to share their work. They wanted to work and collaborate with other people. So jumping ahead, there's some other things that happened, but kind of getting towards me, I came back to O'Reilly after selling GNN, and I did a book called the Hack Series. And I was kind of interested in how people were hacking different things. But this particular book by Rafi Krikorian, who I believe is a Neil student, was about how people were hacking TiVos. TiVo was a digital video recorder, DVR, and it had Linux inside, and that excited every geek in the world. They could take out the hard drive and replace it. They could upgrade the operating system. It was without, at least from TiVo's point of view, they didn't necessarily think of it as open hardware, but the community, realized it could be opened and hacked. And that made me think, I did about 12 books on hacks, and I started thinking, I wonder if I could do a magazine. I never published a magazine. I thought, this is really interesting. And I was going to originally call it Hacks Magazine, but it became Make Magazine. And it was published in 2005, and this is our first issue, and it had kite aerial photography on the cover, and Chris Benton was a UC Berkeley professor who studied architecture, and he was interested in looking at buildings from different heights. And so he would put a camera on a kite and do that. And then it developed into an art form for him, even after he left Berkeley. But I think the key thing we wanted to accomplish was, we started ourselves as a DIY magazine, and in terms of, if you think about a cooking magazine, it has recipes. It wants to help you cook that thing, not just talk about, here's this gourmet chef who creates great things that you should go to his restaurant and taste them. Well, here we want to show you how to do things. And so, and it's kind of interesting to me just to say, why do we do this in print when you can do it online? Well, online didn't really have much of a business model. And print, you could just do more. Graphically, you could create something special. And because we were about tangible things, I wanted to create a tangible thing, something you could hold. So the last thing I kind of say is, I came up with the word make for it, and I was actually referencing the title of a book we published, just it came to mind, that's all. Managing projects with Make was a utility in Unix for compiling programs. And the first line of the program, of the make file, was make : and that's where I came up with the name for that. I just liked it. It was a verb. And then, in the first time, in the welcome in that first issue, I used the term makers. I realized that we don't have readers, we have makers, and began using that. But makers are enthusiasts. They're the term also has sort of a feeling like believers. And, this year we published the 20th anniversary issue. So we've been, a print magazine for 20 years today. So we've, managed to keep it going. And,